Okay, so the last section of this chapter is going to be the social effects of the Industrial Revolution. And it's important to realize, like all elements of history, there is a debate here. There are many people that argue that the Industrial Revolution has dramatically improved our living standards. Most capitalists fall behind this category. Um, you know that many things that now are considered very commonplace were luxury items before the Industrial Revolution. Just the idea, think about how many things we wear that are made out of cotton, and the idea that before the industrialization of textiles, cotton was not commonplace. It was incredibly expensive, and because of industrialization, it becomes easier to come by. People are eating more diversely, people are getting paid more, real wages are going up. But at the same time, you are going to see that this is going to affect different social classes in different ways. So the debate about the Industrial Revolution is, okay, to what extent was the Industrial Revolution really just benefiting the middle class at the expense of the working classes? And after the Industrial Revolution, we're also going to see some new social developments come out of it, especially the birth of socialism and communism, as kind of a reaction to the middle class exploitation of the working class. But kind of at the root of that, just realize that what we're experiencing here with the Industrial Revolution is a growing sense of class consciousness. So, in other words, whichever category you fall into, if you are working in a factory or if you're a person who actually owns a business, puts capital into it, in other words, a capitalist. Okay, so a factory owner or a merchant, someone who, again, actually owns a business and is employing people to work in said business, you're going to see that there's a really huge difference between those two groups of people. All right, so a huge separation between the working class and the people who own property and actually possess capital. So let's talk about the capitalists first. Um, the factory owning classes, in other words. So during the Industrial Revolution, a lot of people argue that this is sort of the golden age of the bourgeoisie, that they are benefiting much more than the working class. But at the same time, we need to realize that there were some difficulties in being a member of the bourgeoisie during the Industrial Revolution. In particular, in order to run a business, it was really difficult to kind of establish a balance between, first, of course, if you're a capitalist, you want to minimize costs. You want to make sure that whatever amount of money you put into making something is obviously going to be less than however much money you're getting out of it. You want to minimize costs and maximize profits. All right. So, how do you do that? Well, one of the major things you need to do is to try to make the price of labor as low as possible. But at the same time, the more labor you have, the greater output you have. So it's a huge difficulty to try to make sure that you're spending very little money to run your business and get a huge profit out of it. So that is something that's difficult for even capitalists to maintain, to establish. So again, labor costs are probably the most burdensome element to being a capitalist. Also, as innovations continue to be developed, there's a huge demand for capitalists to continuously update their machinery to make sure their factories are as state of the art as possible. So that's going to be obviously expensive, and that's going to be something that's going to make being a member of the bourgeoisie difficult. At first, in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, you're going to see that there was a little bit more opportunity for upward mobility, especially last section we were talking about how a lot of countries um, actually would take ownership of paying for industry. Like in Belgium, there were state-owned railroads, for example. You saw Prussia paying for the interest in railroad investments, which kind of frees up opportunities for individual investors to actually begin businesses. Well, this means that at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, more people could get involved, right? So at first, there are a lot more opportunities for artisans, merchants, people who are kind of emerging into the middle class. But as time goes on and factories grow larger, you're going to see that there are fewer and fewer opportunities to move up. Okay, so as factories grow larger and industries become more kind of established, solidly developed, you're going to see that basically the middle class stays relatively stagnant. There are not very many people kind of moving from the lower classes into the middle class. And one of the best ways that you can kind of guarantee your middle class status or stay in the middle class if you already are there is to make sure that you are very educated. So again, you're going to see that education and inheritance is key to maintain a position within the middle class. Um, and another change that you're going to see as time goes on in the Industrial Revolution is that there are fewer and fewer opportunities for women across the board, particularly in the middle class. Women are not going to be seen as kind of appropriate members of the bourgeoisie. If you are a woman and you are in the middle class, your role is more to be working within the home in the private realm. And that's going to be very different from the working class where everybody's poor and everybody needs to work. So shifting over to the working class, another word that we'll introduce here to refer to the working class is the proletariat. Um, so at first, you're going to see that the conditions for the working class are going to be very bad. Part of this is because um, with the agricultural revolution, there was a surplus of labor, right? So at first, just with so many people leaving the farm industry, there were too many people that were working. So if there are too many laborers and there aren't enough jobs, um, uh, there basically aren't enough jobs available, too many people ultimately working. So you're going to see, and also there's so much demand for to move into these jobs that people can be treated relatively poorly because there's always someone on the outside that's going to be waiting to get that job, right? So basically, you're going to see that at first, because there's a surplus of labor, they're pretty poor conditions for workers. They work really long hours, sometimes 14 hours a day, really no such thing as holidays, a lot of times 6-day weeks. Working conditions were very, very unsafe. There's no types of safety regulations. And of course, we talked about child labor in our previous video. Realize that unsafe working conditions really carry over to child laborers. A lot of times they are the people who can kind of fit into those little crevices of a machine. Um, so you're going to see that the unsafe working conditions particularly apply to children, but they apply across the board. And of course, if you're working such long hours, just the fact that you are probably sleep deprived is also going to make your work environment very unsafe. Also, you're not getting paid very much. And that is particularly the case for child workers and women workers. They were employed because they were cheap. All right, so in general, you're going to see the working class conditions very, very poor in these early stages of the Industrial Revolution, which is going to prompt reform later on down the line. So, who are some of the early critics of industrialization? You're going to see an emergence of a group called the Luddites. Now, we still talk about Luddites now. You can be a Luddite if you are sort of anti-technology, that person who's totally resistant to getting a smartphone. Um, those people still are technically Luddites, right? So Luddites are this group of people that emerge that are very anti-machinery. These are Luddites here that are actually smashing machines. So basically, they are so anti-machine because they argue, rightfully so, that it's putting people out of work, right? If you can develop a machine to do somebody's job, well, it's obviously going to be much cheaper to do that. So Luddites actually, a lot of times they would actually, in protest, they would break into factories and actually destroy machinery. Um, so, and again, the word Luddite carries on into today, and the Luddites gained a lot of momentum and strength. And you also are just going to see like a general antagonism towards machinery among members of the working class because of the influence of the Luddites. Another important individual is Frederick Engels. We talk about him a lot when we talk about Karl Marx as well with the birth of socialism. In 1844, Frederick Engels is going to write a book called The Condition of the Working Class. And what he is arguing here is that during the Industrial Revolution, um, the whole reason why certain people are able to become wealthy and produce more benefit from the Industrial Revolution is because they are exploiting the proletariat. Okay, so the whole reason why the Industrial Revolution is profitable is because the middle class is taking advantage of the proletariat. All right, so in other words, he's saying that all of the profits that are generated from the Industrial Revolution are just going to the middle class. The proletariat is making nothing. Okay, so he also was arguing that despite what some people say, the working class is much worse after industrialization, and these arguments are going to be later developed, and they're going to significantly influence Karl Marx and other socialists. But realize that there are some people out there that support industrialization as well, most notably Andrew and Edwin Chadwick. Andrew actually argued that the conditions in factories were fine. He praised them in his work, argued that it was a much better, more organized way of working than it was under the cottage industry, when you can clearly see that some people would take issue with that because you have less independence in a factory work setting. But nonetheless, Andrew argued that factories were a good place to work, and Edwin Chadwick also argued that the increase in purchasing power as a result of the Industrial Revolution benefited the entire population. So a couple of people there that argue in favor of the Industrial Revolution. Thinking about a general historical analysis of the Industrial Revolution. Now realize in the long run, in a lot of ways, everybody benefits. Okay, even though, of course, there are people that are exploiting a working class, paying them very little money so that more products can be produced for very little money and you can profit off of them. Realize that in the long term, even people who were exploited in a way will benefit from the Industrial Revolution, because all of them will be able to buy the cheaper goods that are produced. Okay, so again, so even though certain people are exploited, everyone is benefiting from the fact that more things are going to be available for a lower price. You're also going to see real wages are going to increase dramatically. So in between 1820 and 1850, you're going to see real wages increase almost 50%. However, you're going to see that this is something that affects the working class gradually. Purchasing power, so in other words, your ability to actually use your wages to go out and buy things, is not going to do much at all until after the Napoleonic Wars, partly because even though wages were increasing during the Napoleonic Wars, food prices were also increasing. So purchasing power doesn't really increase until after the Napoleonic Wars, when food prices are going to stabilize. Another thing that some historians talk about is that even though your purchasing power might have increased, they pay a lot of attention also to your general quality of life, your living standards, and argue that those may not have improved as much as your purchasing power. Even though you had higher wages, realize that one of the reasons why that was because you were working longer hours. So that kind of cancels out the greater purchasing power, right? You're spending so much time at work, you don't necessarily have the ability to go out and spend the money that you're actually making. Also realize that you may be working in more cramped, more expensive conditions, because in a factory setting, you are working in a factory town or city. So you might have actually had some higher costs of living associated with this new way of life. Now, one thing that does improve across the board, working and middle class, was diet. You will see that people are eating more diverse foods, but some of this is also just a byproduct of the agricultural revolution. But in general, that type of living standard, people are eating more diverse things. This does benefit everybody. And again, one other thing to keep in mind is that even if purchasing power and wages are rising, living conditions may decline somewhat. A lot of this is because, again, people who are moving to the cities to work, people who are moving to factory towns to work, are living in very compact conditions, oftentimes whole families living in one room. and very poor sanitary conditions. There's no such thing really as codes to make sure that people's apartments are in good condition. So these things are all ultimately negatively affecting people's living conditions. So historians certainly debate about the long-term, short-term effect of the Industrial Revolution in general, saying that in the long term, more people can afford more things.